My name is Chanel Robertson. Welcome to the Digital Benefits Inaugural Quarterly Call. I'm the Community Manager for the Digital Benefits Network here at Georgetown University's Beck Center. And you've probably received some type of communication from me. And if you haven't, you might get lucky after this call to stay connected with us. I'm really excited to jump into today's call, but before we launch into our conversation, I'll go over a few housekeeping items and then pass it to the fellow for the Digital Benefits Network, Ariel Keenan, who will share a bit about the DBN's work on digital identity. She's also responsible for determining the direction of our research and engagement within the digital benefits community. After that, we'll passing over to today's moderator and the researcher for the Digital Benefits Network, Elizabeth Bynum-Sorrell, who will introduce our panelists and facilitate our conversation for today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ariel Keenan, the fellow who leads the Digital Benefits Network. I'm here at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have such an amazing group for our first call of this kind. If you're not already familiar with us, the Digital Benefits Network convenes practitioners who work in and alongside every level of government to spark dialogue, share resources, and support better digital delivery of public benefits and services. Our network lifts up approaches across benefit programs with a focus on food and nutrition, which includes SNAP and WIC, health, which includes Medicaid and CHIP, cash assistance, including TANF and basic income, and unemployment insurance. We both help solve current human-centered digital delivery challenges and also scan for what's on the horizon with ethics and equity lenses. There's many ways for you to engage with our network, including events like these, our communities of practice, which you can read more about on our website, our ongoing research, as well as the tools and publications we produce. You can see more about us on digitalbenefitsnetwork.org. And one of the tools we recently launched back in October, if we go to the next slide, please, is the Digital Benefits Hub. We launched this in partnership with the American Public Human Services Association. And the Hub is a dynamic open source library of resources, case studies, and implementation tools for public benefits professionals. You can access it at digitalbenefitshub.org. And pertinent to today's conversation, you'll actually find a page on digital identity with a collection of resources from across the ecosystem. We're also always looking for new submissions, so please visit the submit page on the Hub to find more details about submitting your work to be featured. On Friday, next slide, please, our team recently published an announcement about our digital identity research agenda, through which we aim to provide an up-to-date, in-depth learnings about identity verification and authentication practices across the core public benefits programs. Driving this research is our concern about applications of identity proofing that create additional burdens for applicants, potentially block benefit seekers from applying or receiving benefits, maybe duplicate processes across programs, and also raise challenging issues about privacy and data security. We're also concerned that the advocacy around recent technology implementations has been an all or nothing approach to remove a type of technology, rather than supporting government practitioners in navigating solutions to produce more equitable outcomes. So following our initial period of research, we released a collection of introductory digital identity resources for benefit practitioners and decision makers who are wading into many of these challenges. This includes a glossary of digital identity terms, a primer on what is digital identity, a short explainer about digital identity in public benefits programs, as well as a high-level overview of federal engagement around digital identity topics. You can find these resources in the link that's being dropped in the chat now. And we're really early in our research and engagement, and we know that there are really a myriad of login and identity verification solutions in place across the programs. And there are likely similar concerns about ethics, privacy, accessibility, and usability popping up. So to help address some of that, we're currently working on an assessment of login and identity proofing practices across unemployment insurance applications. We plan to publicly release this in early 2023 as an open data set that you all will be able to use and view. We're also working with our partners at Code for America to support similar analyses for SNAP, WIC, TANF, and childcare applications, which will also release next year. And we'll be providing a deeper analysis of the challenges, solutions, and needs across benefits programs through surveys, interviews, and events. And we would really love your participation as we put out some of these calls to action. And we know that the future of online access to benefits applications will require the solutions that navigate accessibility and fraud prevention challenges without sacrificing both our usability and equity. And by learning from practitioners like all of you, we hope to highlight the common challenges as well as the best practices that can be shared and amplified. So with that set up, it is my pleasure to pass the mic to Elizabeth Bynum-Sorrell to take us into today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Ariel and Chanel. My name is Elizabeth Bynum-Sorrell, and I'm the researcher for the Digital Benefits Network. We are so excited to host this conversation today, and it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers, April Dunlap and Professor Michele Gilman. Our first panelist, April Dunlap, is the Policy Administrator for the Arizona Department of Economic Security, DES, the state's largest human services agency. April joined DES in 2020 as the Unemployment Insurance Policy Manager during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, providing policy support for the implementation of multiple federal unemployment compensation programs, as well as changes to traditional unemployment insurance benefits. Our second panelist, Michele Gilman, is the Venable Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Development at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Professor Gilman directs the Civil Advocacy Clinic, where she supervises students representing low-income individuals and community groups in a wide range of litigation, legislation, and law reform matters. We're linking April and Michele's full bios in a document in the chat, and I'd like to thank them both for joining us today. Now, I'd like to begin our conversation by setting the scene a little bit. In an effort to respond to national needs during the pandemic, the federal government established the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA, in 2020, for which a record number of people were eligible. The surge in unemployment applications generally and new pandemic programs meant that states faced heavy workloads, leading to backlogs in claims processing. For example, in November of 2020, only 3 states nationally were meeting the federal standard of getting benefit payments out within 3 weeks for 87% of applicants. And many states continued to struggle with prompt processing and payments throughout 2020 and 2021. Attempts to get money out the door quickly also created opportunities for fraud. The U.S. Department of Labor Office of the Inspector General recently increased their estimate of potentially fraudulent unemployment insurance program payments to $45.6 billion paid out between March of 2020 and April 2022. The scale of fraud indicated a clear need for programmatic adjustments. The Department of Labor responded by issuing new guidance around identity verification and fraud detection, and state workforce agencies instituted new requirements for claimants. Although PUA has ended, verification requirements remain in place for regular unemployment insurance programs in many cases. However, efforts to curtail fraud and institute new safeguards and identity proofing checks may also in some cases create accessibility issues and contribute to longer wait times and delays for applicants in systems that already face backlogs. The pandemic clearly impacted the landscape of identity and authentication needs and requirements in government programs. Over the next 25 minutes, I'll speak with our two panelists about digital identity and public benefits, with a special focus on the present and future of identity proofing, highlighting the case of unemployment insurance over the last few years. After that, we'll open up for a Q&A session, so we encourage you to have your questions ready for our panelists. So with that, let's jump right in. April, I would love to start with a question for you. We know that identity proofing and authentication requirements for public benefits applications look different in every state and territory. Could you tell us more about claimants' experiences in Arizona when they file an unemployment insurance claim? What steps do they need to take to create an account and undergo identity proofing?
Yes, absolutely. So in Arizona, we have a few different avenues for application. Most commonly to file an application, people start by navigating to the DES website, and they can either do that on their own, or we also have our local workforce offices where we have computers available for people to log on and apply there as well. And then when you navigate to the UI application page on the DES website, you're presented initially with some language options. You choose one of those, whichever applies to you. And then you're presented with some pretty extensive instructions for how to apply. So after that instruction page, you enter some basic identifying information about yourself, including your social security number. And after that, you're taken to our identity verification page. Again, you're given just some basic instructions about the requirement to verify your identity and options for doing so. So we have an identity verification process that's integrated into that online application, and that seems to be the simplest option for most claimants. You can seamlessly navigate to our vendor ID Me, and that link is embedded right there on the page. You click on it, go through ID Me's verification process, and you're again seamlessly returned right back to the application portal on the DES website. And there you can finish the rest of your UI application, submit the application to DES, and go about your business. On the other hand, of course, we realize that that's not an option for every claimant. Not every claimant applies through the internet. Not every claimant is able to use ID Me, and we needed to have our traditional options available as well. So you can contact the department by phone, and that's an option that's presented on the UI application page. Right when you start the application, it gives our phone number and gives you the option to call our call center. And you're also provided a link to our paper application, which you can either download and print or have mailed to you if you call into the department. So we do make sure to provide alternative options for identity verification, but have found that most people do use that portal to ID Me and back to the application. So that's the basic process. If you're not able to use ID Me and you submit that paper application, we also ask for a hard copy of your identification and are able to manually verify identity that way. And then during the pandemic, a lot of offices, of course, were not safe to be open. So we implemented a process at that time in our rural DES offices where people were less likely to have internet access, especially to make sure that people had an option to come in person and verify their ID that way during the height of the need for it. So we do have a few different methods for identity verification and a few different methods for application for unemployment insurance benefit. And then additionally, if you call the call center, we can help you navigate the process. So explaining how ID Me works, explaining that it's a secure process, explaining that you have other options, making sure that people have those resources available to them to know what their options are and how to really navigate the entire system when they call in.
Thanks so much, April. I think for our audience, it might also be interesting to hear more about Arizona's decision process when selecting an identity proofing vendor. So, for example, what factors shaped that decision? What were some of the trade-offs that your agency was balancing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So like you mentioned in the intro, like many other states, like most other states in the nation during the pandemic, we found ourselves just inundated with suspected identity theft fraud, especially in the PUA program. And during the first few months of the pandemic, you start to see applications come in, and then at a certain point, it's like, there's just no way that these are all real people. And it turns out that most of them, or not most necessarily, but a lot of them were not real people, depending on what point during the pandemic we're looking at. So as you mentioned, that created just an immense workload, an immense backlog for us to try to find the real people in that huge group of applications that we had. And we knew that as much as we needed to prevent fraud, we also needed to be able to find those real people to serve the actual Arizonans that were in need of assistance during the pandemic. And it was, like you said, a larger amount of people than ever. So we had to identify who those people were and then be able to verify that they were who they said they were. And it seemed like an identity proofing solution would provide an immediate avenue for people to be able to do that. The way that we heard about ID.me initially was, like many of you, we were on one of those workforce phone calls with other states. I know NASLA was when there were quite a few going on during the pandemic, especially, and heard that other states had an interest in ID.me. And so we started to look into it ourselves and realized we already had a contract vehicle in place in Arizona that would allow us to work with ID.me pretty quickly. And also realized that at that time, there weren't a lot of other vendors operating in this space. So it wasn't like there was a ton of options to choose from at the time. So it made it a really easy choice to move forward with ID.me. We piloted the ID.me program initially with groups of people that we suspected may be real. So we really tried to target the richest groups for us that we thought we could get the most real people identified and moved forward with. And then we continued to roll it out in phases. So for instance, new PUA applications were one group of applicants that we focused on and continued to phase in all of the other groups until we ended up with a full ID verification requirement for all unemployment benefits programs. And based on the success of our identity verification system in general, including our use of ID.me, we continued to implement it for programs outside of unemployment and insurance and unemployment benefits. So for instance, our emergency rental assistance program also uses ID.me at this point. One trade-off that's going to be present, like you mentioned, no matter what verification solution you're using, is that you want to find those real people, but you also don't want to create a barrier for people to apply for any program, including unemployment insurance. So it was really important to us that our vendor was aware of that and sensitive to not creating that barrier. And ID.me was really on top of it. They made themselves available to us basically 24/7 when we were implementing identity verification. They provided us access to their development, communications team, even their CEO. I can remember being on many phone calls with him. So that accessibility was really important to us. They provided us updates hourly in the beginning to let us know how many successful attempts or how many attempts were made, how many were successful, really gave us that data that we needed to make sure that we weren't putting a barrier in place for people unnecessarily. And we're also responsive to our claimants' needs for assistance. So if we requested that instructional document be updated or revised or even created, they came through with that almost immediately and made sure that our claimants were receiving the information that they needed in order to be able to successfully use the solution.
Thanks, April. I think that's really interesting context for our audience to hear. And turning now to you, Michele, you studied the safety net from a legal perspective for many years, drawing on your experience as a clinician. And earlier this year, you published an article looking at the rollout of identity verification in unemployment insurance programs during the pandemic. And for our audience, we'll be sharing a link to that in the chat. But Michele, could you tell our audience more about your primary findings in that article?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to the Digital Benefits Network for inviting me to share my research. Let me start by telling you about one of my clients, which is how I became interested in this issue. In March 2020, the pandemic cost my client, Joe Clark, not his real name, his job as a hospital food service worker. He applied online for unemployment insurance benefits, which he received for a few weeks. But then his payments abruptly stopped and his account was frozen. And the State Department of Labor was posting messages to his account asking that he verify his identity. But at the same time, they denied him access to his account. So we were in a classic catch-22. My client had numerous documents proving his identity, but he was unable to upload them or to reach a human being at the state agency who could help him through the process. And so the technology that was designed to help citizens in their time of need utterly failed him. And without income, it's a sad story. He couldn't make his rent. He became homeless. He suffered mental distress. And his story isn't an isolated one. There were thousands upon thousands of Joe Clarks across America. And so my paper explores 3 barriers that I found to fair and effective digital identity verification: inequity in platform design, lack of due process, and concerns around privatization. And so I'll talk a little bit about each one in turn. So first, let me start with design inequity. These systems appear to be designed with privileged users in mind. The developers appear to assume that claimants own a computer and know how to use it, that they're literate, that they speak English. Yet for many populations who faced unemployment during the pandemic, that wasn't true, right? Particularly those that were low income, elderly, disabled, and non-English speaking. Moreover, about 1/3 of low-income people, like Mr. Clark, access the internet solely through a smartphone. And yet certain UI platforms were fully accessible only if you had a computer. Other unemployed people lacked access to the internet at all. Due to a persistent digital divide in this country, 20% of Americans don't have a smartphone. 25% don't have home broadband. And low-income Americans and minorities are disproportionately disconnected. Certain design features seem designed to ensnare innocent people. So for instance, if several applications use the same address, it can result in a fraud alert, even though it's very common for multi-generational families to share an address. And that cohort of people grew dramatically during the pandemic and its associated housing crisis. A shared address is also a feature of congregate housing settings, like homeless shelters. Fraud alert systems also commonly flag ethnic names and those that don't follow American naming conventions. And so all of this means that these systems can be tilted towards capturing fraud rather than delivering benefits to people in need. Okay, so second, let me talk a little bit about the due process concerns that I saw from my perspective as an attorney. Due process was undermined by unclear ID verification requirements, and so government assistance was often reduced or denied without the required notice and hearing. Across the country, states failed to clarify the acceptable forms of identity documentation, and this left unfettered discretion in the hands of frontline workers and system designers. There was just a sense that agencies were making it up as they went along, without legislative direction, without notice and comment, without these procedures that are designed to improve accountability of government systems. For instance, in my state, I looked and looked for written identity requirements. I couldn't find them anywhere. And yet client after client was rejected because their documents weren't in color, or all 4 corners weren't apparent, or both sides of the document weren't provided, or edges were frayed, and so on and so on. And the lack of clear standards is particularly difficult when it comes to people who don't have photo IDs. We know that 11% of voters lack photo identification, and that this gap widens for minorities and the elderly, who face a lot of barriers to obtaining just, a basic driver's license or similar identification. They might not have the funds to pay for ID. Transportation can be a barrier. Identity issuing offices often have irregular or limited hours. And so as we expand identity verification requirements, what are we going to do to ensure that those groups are not left behind? Okay. Finally, I talk about my concerns around privatizing identity verification. It definitely raises questions about the appropriate outsourcing of government functions. This isn't about buying paper clips. This is about the relationship between citizens and the state. And private vendors do not share the same transparency requirements, data security requirements, and constitutional requirements as the government. So, as April highlighted, sometimes this privatization can work well, but that wasn't always the case during the pandemic. Over half the states were like Arizona, contracting with private companies to handle identity verification. Thousands of claimants struggled with this. Part of the problem is that some of the platforms use facial recognition technology, which research has established is notoriously inaccurate for non-white people, particularly women of color. Further, the backup system that needs to be in place, as April mentioned, of having human beings to help with the identity verification, wasn't working. People were waiting for hours or even days to reach a human being to verify their identity. And many gave up in the interim, right? And just completely disengaged from the system. So privatization, it just raises profound questions that we need to have robust discussions about, which were hard during the pandemic, a time of emergency. But what is the role and responsibility of government when it privatizes its services? Should biometric data of citizens be in the hand of private companies? What mechanisms of accountability and transparency does a private company have towards the citizens, not just towards its contracting partner, but toward the citizens whose lives are being impacted? Do these agencies have the human and technical capacity to engage in procurement and oversight processes of their private vendors? Is a for-profit model even compatible with human welfare? So we need to be discussing these issues through democratic fora, and for the most part, we're not. So I'm going to stop there. I've highlighted sort of my three main concerns here, and we'll welcome any questions about any aspect of what I've talked about.
Thanks, Michele. I know that's a lot to dig into in a short period of time, but just a follow-up question for you. In your article, you also write about paths forward for identity verification and benefits programs. Could you speak a little bit about the recommendations you outlined for equitable implementation of identity verification approaches?
Sure, I'd be happy to highlight a few suggestions that I think would improve the system for claimants. First, current identity verification processes seem to be built on a fraud-first presumption that really reflects a lot of distrust and othering of people who need governmental assistance. And that presumption really needs to be flipped. The primary goal needs to be serving eligible citizens in an equitable and timely manner and not seeking out fraud. Digital platforms need to be designed with the needs, interests, and input of impacted claimants at the forefront. For instance, having a platform that is accessible by a smartphone is an example. Identity verification requirements need to be clear and specific with alternate in-person options for people who are digitally disconnected. I think it's important that agencies not require identity verification prior to receipt of benefits. Verification should happen later in the process after an application is filed. While preventing fraud is absolutely important, these systems require far more sophisticated analytics for identifying suspected criminal conduct than what appears to currently be in use. Outsourcing of identity verification should be undertaken with the utmost of care. We need very rigorous procurement processes and requirements and ongoing auditing and oversight. So government agencies should be regularly auditing their identity verification systems for access and accuracy and publicly reporting the relevant data. I'd love to see agencies working across their respective domains to streamline identity verification procedures rather than putting people through multiple conflicting processes each time they need to interface with the state. And finally, I really think the collection and retention of biometric data needs to be approached with extreme caution. And I mean, I would prefer it not be undertaken at all, but if it is, with very significant limits on collection, retention, and use of that data. So those are some sort of at a high level, some broad suggestions that I would have from a legal services perspective to improve the system for my clients.
Thanks, Michele. A lot to dig into there in terms of what those things might look like. And April, coming back to you, we've talked a lot today about the current landscape of digital identity and public benefits, but we also really want to be looking ahead to what's next. So thinking ahead to 2023, which is really just around the corner. Could you tell us more about DES's priorities for online access to unemployment insurance in the coming year?
Yes. So along the lines of what Michele was just talking about, continuing to make sure that we are not putting a barrier in place for any applicant who is applying for benefit. Notably, during the pandemic, Arizona is really proud of never having to shut down our system. We never blocked access to our portal based on the ability to verify your identity. So there was never a requirement to verify your identity before you could even get in to verify your identity. And then making sure, our contract with ID.me hinges on successful identity verification. So there's an incentive to make sure people are able to verify their identities for our vendor as well. So continuing to make sure that we have those safeguards in place and that we are making it as easy as possible for people to use that solution or to use another solution if that's what works better for them. We're right now working with a legacy, as we call it, UI application system. I remember when I first started working at DES, everyone said, our system's as old as you are. And I thought, oh, that's really funny, but also realized the more I worked with it, how many obstacles that can pose. So we are underway with a full system modernization. We are still in the procurement process there, but continuing to move forward with it. And then our priorities specifically for that system, focusing on making sure they are access centered. So improving our application processing, our application system to begin with for the claimant facing side of it. And then on our side of it, the processing timeliness, making sure that the system moves things forward as quickly as possible. First payment timeliness is a priority. Quality of adjudication, so a system that enables us to be as accurate and quick as possible with adjudication. Reducing our call center wait times, I think, will definitely have a positive impact on clients. Also reducing the number of times or at all that a client needs to contact us with inquiries. If we have a website and a portal and our phone system that provides people with the answers that they're looking for before they need to contact us, that enables them to move through the system so much more quickly and without barriers. And also reducing our system maintenance costs. I mean, that's not really an accessibility issue, but also is a priority of our system modernization. Knowing that alongside the modernization, we also need to maintain and improve the avenues of access that I've been talking about that are not online, that are not system related, but that provide people an opportunity to access the system in the same way that someone can do it online. So looking at what those alternatives are and how we can improve them in the upcoming year or two. We did apply for and receive the Department of Labor's equity grant for UI. So we're excited about that. A couple of the things we're doing with that are to update the forms that we send to claimants to make sure that we're only asking for the information we actually need. We're not asking them to provide us with anything that's not going to be used in the adjudication process. Removing ineffective or complicated language from those forms. I mean, even as the person who is often responsible for reviewing forms, I sometimes look at drafts and think, I don't know what that means. There's definitely not going to be a way that the average person who's not involved in the system knows what that means. So looking really critically at the language that we're using, both in our forms and on our website that provides people with just general information and making sure that it is clear and understandable and not creating another barrier for people to understand how the system works and how what information we are requesting from them and how they can provide it. And alongside that, like I mentioned, just updating our website to improve. People really need to be able to quickly understand what we need from them, what they need to provide, and what the process is, that procedural justice kind of concept, that if people can understand why the system works the way it does and how it works the way it does and why we're asking for what we're asking for, I think it'll be much easier for them to provide it to us and for us to not be asking for things that we don't actually require. Oh, and one other thing I forgot to mention is the translation of our forms and our website into multiple languages other than English and Spanish, so that you're automatically able to access the language that you need without having to request those translation or interpretation services.
Thanks so much for sharing about that, April. I think it's a lot of exciting work coming from DES. So I want to make sure that we have lots of time for our Q&A. I do have 2 more questions for our panelists before we do that. But for our attendees, you can go ahead and start submitting questions you have in the chat just to get us queued up for that. So Michele, one of the ideas you discuss in your article about identity verification is this concept of design justice. And design was one of the barriers you identified to implementing identity verification approaches. Could you talk a little bit more about what this idea of design justice means, where it comes from, and how it can be applied to benefits delivery?
Sure. The concept of design justice has really been put forth by a movement of designers and tech developers, along with community-based organizations. It provides a framework for analysis of how design itself distributes benefits and burdens between various groups of people. And we definitely saw that with identity verification. It has its roots in the participatory design movement that was happening in Scandinavian countries in the 1970s as their workplaces were being transformed by technology. And I think at its core, it's really seeking to challenge structural inequities that become embedded in technology design. So there's a wonderful book called Design Justice by Sasha Costanza-Chock that talks about this in much greater detail, and a website for the design justice movement. But I think the core takeaways of those resources are that input from and accountability to impacted communities is essential when designing technology. So, for instance, one of the core principles is that, and I'm quoting here, everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience, and that we all have unique and brilliant contributions to bring to a design process. And when I read, statements expressing that sort of commitment, and I think back to the rollout of identity verification, it was really contrary to those principles. It was very top down. It did not involve impacted communities or other stakeholders in the design process. It didn't seek to sustain, heal, and empower communities as design justice practitioners aspire to do. And just constantly, as I was representing clients through the system, I just thought, greater consultation with the stakeholders. And it wouldn't even have had to take too much time or resources, but it would have avoided so many of the design failures that claimants faced. And so much of what was going on felt quite preventable to me in terms of legitimate claimants being denied, access to benefits based on identity verification.
Thanks so much, Michele. I think really helpful to get some of that kind of contextual background for some of the concepts that can be used in benefits delivery. And now this is our last question that we'll be asking panelists before we open up for Q&A. But April, coming back to you, from your perspective at Arizona DES, do you have any additional thoughts about the types of support federal agencies can provide to state programs, especially thinking about digital identity topics?
Sure. So I think it was with the Continued Assistance Act that Congress actually implemented ID verification as a legal requirement. And that really helped us to be able to have conversations with our external stakeholders, with people who were asking, hey, how is this working? It was very helpful to be able to add weight to the understanding that the identity theft is a problem that needs to be addressed, and it's even now a legal requirement for application or for eligibility. So more of a legal framework for putting in place some of the requirements that we find ourselves needing to put in place in order to make sure that the system is accessible, equitable, and also we're not issuing benefits to people who are not who they say they are. So providing additional guidance and standards for ID verification, DOL has done a really good job of providing us with guidance throughout the pandemic and after. So continuing to do that specific to ID verification would be really helpful, and making sure that it's it's uniform across all states. As we're hearing from Michele, states all had different problems in implementing and moving forward with this requirement. It sounds like some were much more severe than others, but if we had uniform guidance, that would be less of a concern. Funding is always helpful and needed. So in order to implement an equitable and sophisticated solution, we need to be able to pay for it. And also to provide those alternative avenues to claimants, we need to be able to pay for those too. So having staff who are available to verify ID in person if necessary and answer questions that cost money. And some of that emergency funding that we received during the pandemic to operate programs at that time is of course not sustained. So a long-term funding solution will be really helpful. Additional research from people like Michele and DBN to understand what are the problems that people are encountering and what are some proposed solutions to those problems would be really helpful for states as well. And then a potential federal solution is always something that I think states are interested in, as long as it is as effective and easy to implement and can be implemented by all of the different states that administer UI and making sure that it's compatible with their systems as well.
Thank you, April, so much for that response. And thank you both, Michele and April, so much for sharing with our audience. I know I really appreciated the opportunity to learn from both of you. So while we have covered a lot of ground, I imagine that our attendees still have lots of questions, reflections, and comments. And we would love to hear from all of you in the chat box. We will also be using the raise hand function, as we'd love to literally hear other voices in this space. If you opt to raise your hand, we will call on you and invite you to unmute to share your question with our panelist. And even if this is just an idea you want to put out there to wrestle with, we encourage you to share it. So we'll work through the questions in just a moment, but as those queue up, we'd like to take this opportunity to use a Zoom poll to learn more from you, our attendees, about what you would like to see in our quarterly calls going forward. But yeah, as that poll opens up, we really invite you to submit your questions in the chat or to use the raise hand function. As questions start coming in from our audience, Michele, I actually have another question I'd love to have the opportunity to pose to you, similar to what we just asked April. From your perspective and conversations with other clinicians and legal advocates, what types of federal guidance on digital identity do you think might help state agencies effectively implement identity verification and authentication in benefits programs? What priorities have advocates identified in this space?
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, they overlap a lot with what April was just discussing, because we're all really on the same page. We want to get benefits to the people who legitimately qualify, and we want, criminal syndicates not to get these benefits, this money that is due to our unemployed workers. So I would love at the federal level to see the government funding research on best practices in this space and disseminating this research, sort of similar to what the network is doing. I'd like to see the federal government continue to develop federal identity verification software that could be used across programs, moving more towards a one-stop shop type of approach. It's important that we have clarity on what documents satisfy identity verification. And even if that is left to states on a state-by-state level, that mandate, that requirement should be federally enforced. The federal government needs to reaffirm a commitment to the due process requirements and sort of specify how states are expected to meet those when it comes to identity verification. I definitely think we need a top-down mandate for viable in-person options as a backup, again, for people who are digitally disconnected. So especially when it comes to unemployment insurance, it is a federal state program. Each sphere has its own responsibilities, but I do think there's more that the federal government could do to standardize standards and expectations than what we saw happening during this time of crisis.
Thanks so much, Michele. And yeah, just following up on Chanel's post in the chat, if you have any questions, we are eager to hear from you, our attendees, to understand sort of what questions you have for our panelists, or broader questions about the DBN's work and research. Open to both. As folks take an opportunity to ask their questions, I actually do have more questions. This is a topic that I have really enjoyed getting to learn more about over the last several months in our work at the Digital Benefits Network. And again, just such a pleasure to learn from both of you, April and Michele. April, this question is for you. Something that I think this came up a little bit in the conversation, and something that we spoke about before the panel were some of the specific challenges that Arizona faces in benefits delivery, including having rural areas with limited broadband access and the importance of being able to process tribal identification documents. Could you speak more about some of the specific contexts in which DES is operating? I see we also have a couple questions coming in on the chat. Very excited to hear from our audience. So the first question there, I think, is slightly different, but maybe related. Any recommendations for how to make systems easier to use and ease of access for people who may not have an address or PO box? So April, if you'd like to answer that first question I posed, and maybe add some comments on that second question from Maya in the chat. And then Michele, we also invite you to answer that question from Maya as well in a moment.
Sure. For the question that came through the chat, I think it's also, or primarily, really important for us to make sure we're communicating to the public that there are avenues to application that don't require you to have your own access to the internet, or even to have a phone. If you go into our Arizona at Work offices, you can apply there using their equipment, using, everything you need should be there, and there's staff on hand to help you use that equipment if you need it. So making sure that people aren't unaware of the avenues to access. I don't actually know that having a physical address is a requirement for us for the program. I would have to check into that, but I believe that you are able to access unemployment benefits without having a physical address or a PO box. So I think more of the barrier there would be not knowing that you're able to apply for benefits without having your own individual access. And then to answer your other question, sorry, Arizona does have a lot of rural areas that don't have broadband access. So our governor recently committed $100 million to improving broadband access in those rural areas, which will give more people an opportunity to apply online who may not be able to right now. I spoke with one of our program administrators last week and found out that tribal identification has been added as a primary identification option for ID.me, I believe. So we are making progress in those areas, but yes, with a large tribal population and with a lack of broadband access, there are certain considerations that we need to make at DES to ensure that everyone does have the same ability to access the system.
Thanks so much, April. Michele, did you want to respond as well?
I don't have much to add. I thought that was very helpful. I mean, absolutely, having an address should never be a requirement for any public benefits. There are ways to work around and to manage that. At the same time, we do need to focus on getting people who are unhoused into accessible housing, which is an issue for another day. So sometimes we just see other structural, problems in society that then get refracted and reflected in public benefits delivery systems. So it's always a good reminder that those reflections that we see need systemic reform at sort of their place of origin.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We have a couple other questions that came into the chat just now. I'm realizing we're very close to time, but want to give at least an opportunity to answer the first one there. Harold's question in the chat: is there an example of a place that is doing it more right with regards to identity verification that leads with people, not with fraud prevention? And And I believe Kriti's follow-up question in the chat sort of ties into that. Is there an identity verification system out there doing it right or better when it comes to accessibility for people with lower tech fluency, languages other than English, and inclusion of non-social security number holders? Michele or April, would either one of you like to respond to those questions?
I think April should talk about that. Sounds like Arizona has a good handle on what's going on and is willing to learn and change as new situations arise.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I didn't want to brag about Arizona, but I will as long as you're giving me the opportunity. I do think that having all of those avenues of access that we've been talking about is really key. So ID.me has been crucial to ensuring that we can find the people within the group of applications who are who they say they are and are valid applicants. Other than that, there have to be other ways for people to be able to access the system, and improving those ways. During the pandemic, we didn't really have the opportunity to pause and think about what is the absolute best way to do this and how can we make sure that we're providing the absolute most access. And now that we have that opportunity, just taking a step back as we have been doing and looking at recommendations from people like Michele, I would say there are plenty of other states who are doing that as well, and who are doing it the right way. And so also looking at what other states are doing and forming partnerships with other states is really crucial to making sure that best practices are at least discussed and then implemented.
Thanks so much, April and Michele. Seeing that we're just a few minutes short of the hour, we will end the Q&A there, but so excited to hear from many of you in the chat. And I know we're going to be eager to keep this conversation going after this event. And Chanel, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. That was a really great Q&A session. I know we have some more questions, so we'll be sure to hopefully try to address those in the resource document and be able to continue this conversation throughout the year. I wanted to take a quick second and briefly call on Jeremy Grant to share another great digital identity call and resources launching next week before we close out. So Jeremy, if you could unmute yourself and I'll put you on the spotlight really quickly and you can share about the call coming up.
Hey, thanks, Chanel, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. So I'm Jeremy Grant. I serve as the coordinator of an industry group that started about 5 years ago called the Better Identity Coalition, which is looking at what I call the policy layer of digital identity, looking for ways that government can actually start to put policies in place that address a lot of the issues we talked about today to come up with better identity solutions that work for everybody. I'll share the focus goes well beyond government benefits. I think a key thing that sometimes has gotten lost the last couple of years as we've had all of this focus on the fraud during the pandemic is that it's the same bad actors, the same organized criminals that are taking advantage of the same 2 or 3 challenges or deficiencies in identity infrastructure to steal not just from government, but from banks and fintech apps, healthcare, retail, cryptocurrency exchanges. It's really a problem across the globe. And so our coalition's a group that was formed actually in the wake of the Equifax breach about 5 years ago, focused on what should the government actually do right now. A lot of our members are companies like financial services firms or healthcare firms that are the big buyers of digital identity solutions and that are looking for something better. And a lot of where our policy recommendations have focused is that the government needs to take a bigger role in really, how would I say it, closing the gap between the nationally recognized authoritative identity systems we have that work in the paper world, whether they're issued at the federal, state, or local level, and the digital space that we're trying to do things. So the reason I was given a couple minutes is we 5 years ago published a report called Our Policy Blueprint for Better Digital Identity that was really focused at the federal level and has led to the introduction of a bipartisan bill that may yet pass before the end of the year, the Improving Digital Identity Act. Next Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern, we're going to be releasing our state policy blueprint, which is really focused on governors and state legislatures, looking at the role that states can play in coming up with better systems. Thank you, Louisa, for posting the registration link for that event. So we'll be going through our 6 policy recommendations. We'll have a panel moderated by Ben Fried at State Scoop with some state officials and industry officials as well. And hope you can tune in and look at the blueprint and also give us feedback afterwards. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. And the link to RSVP has been dropped in the chat for anybody who's interested in attending. As we close out, we were so delighted to have you all here with us today and are looking forward to your contributions to the Digital Benefits Network. If you haven't already, please join and subscribe to the DBN to stay informed and in the know about upcoming events. You'll find those links on the resource document. And then as we wrap up this year, I'd like to share a final reminder to just stay in contact with us, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, to stay connected. And if you weren't able to complete the poll earlier, a survey will pop up at the end of this call. And if you did get to do the poll, you can skip the survey. With that, we'll move it and close out. The Digital Benefits Network is wishing you all a warm winter holiday season, and we hope to see you all in 2023. Thank you so much for being here today. And if you have questions that we didn't get to in this last few minutes, I'll stay on a few more minutes to take questions in the chat, and we'll get those to April and Michelle and hopefully continue this conversation in the new year. Thank you so much, y'all.